this was something that even shocked a lot of the people who think that, Russia's too strong to fail, too big to fail, too big to fail. We're back 2008, but on a national scale, apparently, except for all those times it did fail. Like in, World War I and, the Soviet collapse and the first Chechen war. But, besides all of the moments in history, including living memory, too big to fail. When I said on panels like, hey, the Russian economy is in such a bad spot that they have banned the export of gasoline, the fuel. They're no longer, they're not exporting it anymore. They've suspended it for the month in order to recover due to a domestic fuel crisis where there are lines, queues out in the countryside for fuel. And I remember like people trying to fact check me, like, is that true? Send me the source. I was like, well, okay, there you go. It's head of, it's the head of Russian state. Here you go. Here's Russian state TV talking about it. Here is the Russian papers talking about it openly. Like, and you don't need to trust that it's by translation. You can go listen to Steve Rosenberg talk about it, maybe some Julia Davis translations of some TV channels, or you can just go check out any of the tons of Telegram channels that translate what comes from Russia. Either way, it's clear what's happening. And now it's gotten worse with the Russians deciding not only is it going to be a suspension of fuel sales for 1 month, but they're suspending these sales all the way up until the end of the year. So they're no longer exporting gasoline. They're not exporting petrol. These are not things that they're throwing into the international market anymore. They're keeping it domestic in order to supply Russian consumers and try to stop the crisis, which means the loss of sales. Mind you, some people will hear that and say, oh, okay, they're no longer exporting gasoline. I guess that means, Russia's not selling anything anymore. That's a little simplistic. The Russian economy and the energy market is actually, quite sizable. Of course, it makes up like a third of state revenue. So it's a little bit more expansive than that. They're going to continue to try to export LNG, liquefied natural gas, I imagine. They're still going to try to, continue exports to China. They're still going to try to continue, crude exports to India. If they can refine some stuff and send it, but they're not going to be able to send out everything that they used to because they simply need to meet the domestic demand. And it's getting severe enough that the longer this goes on, it risks a political crisis. And Putin, afraid of that political crisis, is suspending those exports. Now, what's interesting about this, and man, I should really put something else on the screen, is this is happening at the same exact time that the Russians have reformed their military budget. I don't know if you guys heard, but the Russians have actually adjusted the military budget for next year, and they've lowered it. Why are they lowering it? It's not just a question of, hey, we're not going to raise subsidies anymore, and through the process of inflation, the social program has been lowered. They lowered it. What does that indicate? It indicates that they probably have realized that the Ukrainians aren't caving in this year. They're not getting the gigantic breakthrough that they wanted. And while I am expecting another major push from the Russians in the Pokrovsk direction within the next few months, if not within this or the next month being the most likely period, definitely from the troop redeployments that I'm seeing, whether that is an intensification of offensives or some attempt for some concentrated mechanized offensive, I do not know. It'll be difficult to pull off a mechanized offensive in a pincer maneuver around Pokrovsk due to just how thin the pincer is and how movement could be tracked and the tons and tons of drone cover. But they're going to continue these offensive operations through the winter, and they're going to target Ukrainian energy going into the winter. They're taking this war into the next year. The war is continuing to drag on, and within 100 days, this war will be going on longer than the Great Patriotic War, as the Russians refer to it. World War II, as it's known to the rest of the world. Now, that doesn't mean, 6 years. No, for the Russians, the Great Patriotic War did not start when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. In fact, they then invaded Poland in agreement with the Nazis. They then invaded Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and a bunch of other countries that the Nazis and the Soviets signed away their independence without their consultation, signed away their independence from Soviet control, Soviet occupation, Soviet invasion. And so for 2
Burns
years,
is an
that's how it
immoral,
went.
morally corrupt,
So when we talk
bankrupt
about
man.
the Great Patriotic War and how the Russians are talking about World War II and how the Russians compare this to World War II and so much memorabilia and so much imagery, they now have to start processing the idea that this war could very well go longer than the Great Patriotic War, grinding on and on and on, longer than Chechnya, and now longer than the Great Patriotic War. Now, of course, this isn't longer than Afghanistan. This isn't longer than any military engagement the Soviet Union or anything that Russia's ever been a part of has ever taken place or ever taken part in. For example, many people remember that during the super high stakes, serious negotiations when the Russians were very seriously considering the peace initiatives put forward by the West because they are very interested in peace and consultation and, we are of the earth, we are one, whatever. They said to the Ukrainian delegation, after not wanting the American delegation there, hey, we'll fight for 21 years. That's what we did with Sweden. Do you want to fight for 21 years? So that's the way they talk. It's not that Russia's never engaged in that type of warfare before. Engaged in warfare for that long, but this type of warfare is very different than Russia's war against Sweden. Geopolitics is very different. Civil society is very different. How informed the people are very different. The type of weapons that are being used, the casualty rates are very different. The economic effects are different. There's so many other things that are to be considered that a 21-year war like this style is not possible. So when you're dragging on for this long, eventually you have to ask yourself, how do you balance civil discontent with the continuation of a war that the majority of the Russian public wants to see negotiated an end to? That doesn't mean the majority of the Russians want to, withdraw from Ukraine and want to say, anything for peace, which, might be the moral position, but it's not the position of wider Russian society. But polling does indicate, Russian polling indicates that the majority of Russians would be satisfied if they negotiated something, where the lines probably lie. That they would be satisfied with negotiating right now and not going over to occupy all of Ukraine. And there might be a question of exactly what that line would look like, whether it be exactly where it is, which is a question I think the Russian government's asking. If they drew a line right where it is, would that be acceptable to the Russian public, or do they have to go for more? I think also that consideration is balanced out by their personal interests as well, where you say, well, the Russian public wants me to go for more. The Russian public would never accept me not going for more. So we just have to keep pushing until we have Zaporizhia. We just have to keep pushing until we have Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. So whether or not their judgment is actually consideration, or just of whether or not the Russian public would have a backlash, what did we all just die for? Or it is the elite justifying their ideology, justifying what they believe to go out there and do that. It's hard to exactly say. Either way, the Russian public is going to carry out the war, so they have to figure out how to balance that. The majority of the Russian public is fine with the war continuing due to apathy, not active support and initiative and engagement. That isn't saying that there isn't sections of society that do, but the majority of the Russian public has grown apathetic, and the less you can include them, the more they'll probably be able to allow the affairs to go on. That's why they don't want the economy to go into a crisis, because then the war is affecting their living standard. And it's also why the government has been so hesitant to just go out and be like, okay, we're drafting people, this is taking too long, this is too difficult, we're going to start drafting everybody. If you're a conscript, you're going, even if you didn't sign a contract for military engagement, and we're going to start, we're going to do, Vietnam style. If you're born March 31st, go to the front, They don't want to do that because that active participation challenges the apathy that kind of has allowed this war to carry on for so long and so brutally, while isolating those who would be most hesitant to participate or would be most upset about participating. And that's why instead of engaging in a much cheaper method of drafting people or conscripting them, the method that Ukraine, does more often, even if people are paid for direct frontline service, at higher amounts. They can do that, and they do that because the war's on their territory. It's a war of national survival. Whereas arguing to somebody in Moscow that if they don't go to fucking if they don't go and fight the Ukrainians along the Dnieper River, that soon they're going to be losing their backyard. It's not as appealing. I mean, there are even some people in Western Ukraine who actually have a harder time believing that. Not a lot, but there are some people just due to that distance. But you're going to make that argument to somebody in the Moscow suburbs who has never seen no Ukrainian attack them, who's ever seen no Ukrainian do anything outside of now the drone attacks that are shutting down your airport. So the more you can isolate the Russian public and keep that apathy afloat, the better it's going to be for Russia. And so I think that's what this is ultimately motivated by. They know that they could continue to make these sales. They know they could probably continue to take that money and invest it into the war effort. But ultimately, they want to keep the Russian people signed on to the war project. The more and more opposition that grows to it, the harder it's going to be to recruit new people, the more likely they're going to have to take measures that is going to make it just that more opposed. If the public is getting upset with the war, if they take measures that includes the public more in the war and in a way that they don't, sign up to, it's dangerous. It's dangerous for the Russian government, at least. I want to make sure that my position is not misconstrued in any way, and I want to make sure that it's very clear for the people who'd not heard it. The Russian economy is in a deficit, and the deficit is going to nearly double in 2025. It's going to increase from 1.7% of GDP to 2.6. Mind you, the Russian government historically, under Vladimir Putin, has run a lot of surpluses in order to build up reserves. Reserves that through this war, they have burnt through more and more and more, not just in their foreign cash reserves, but also when it comes to their supply of gold. And so eventually, the Russian government had to find ways to make up the money that they're spending on the war as they continue to gouge down on war industry. And with war industry being the only section of the Russian economy that is growing, outside of maybe the growing coffin industry. So they've done a few things. One thing they did is they froze social services, meaning that their money is being inflated away. If you got, say, a little bit of social assistance in order to assist you with buying food, now you get the same exact amount, but that's inflated away with inflation, where before maybe they would adjust it to deal with the inflation, adjust it to deal with cost of living. Now they're dealing with pre-war social services not adjusted for inflation over 3 to 4 years. That is one way that they've been able to save money on the margins. Another way that they've now are trying to pursue saving money on the margins is that they are increasing a VAT tax. Essentially, what they're going to be doing is they're going to be taxing goods at every stage of production, both from the people producing the goods all the way down to the consumer as the costs are passed down to them, in order to try to make up the money, not to get rid of the deficit. They're not going to be able to pull that off, but in order to shrink the deficit. As the energy production that they used to use in order to make up these differences, in order to make up the problem, starts to get targeted more and more by Ukraine's long-range drone program. We know that this year, the Ukrainians are going to produce more drones than in any other year of the war, and by a sizable margin, either nearly doubling it or even doubling it in production. So when you have that much drone production, and you're throwing those many drones at airfields, at ammunition storages, at munitions factories, but also at oil refineries, at, the actual energy infrastructure that exports, the ports and the gear that actually loads it onto the ships. We had reports from Reuters that 17% of Russian refining capacity, a record, had been knocked out. Shortly after, that number was adjusted to 20%. There's a chance it's above 20% now, with that estimation coming from the United States. But that means 1 out of every 5 refineries brought into a state of unreadiness, not giving the Russian government the money they want. Mind you, if you take out these refineries, what these refineries do is they take Russian product and they turn them into finer goods that can then be sold at a higher market price. But if you don't have the refineries, you take that product and you export it as crude in barrels. which is going to be sold for a lesser price, and it will merely be refined in other locations, and they'll make the money. Now, you'll, of course, still make some money from crude, but this also has diminishing returns. See, if the Russians were to simply turn all of their refineries off and just do crude export, or if the Ukrainians disabled enough that it was just basically crude export, the problem is the more crude they put on the market, the more crude goes down in value. Meaning that not only are you losing money from not selling the refined goods, but you also then lose money from crude going down in its international market price. Because you're supplying more crude, supply and demand, you can put the puzzle pieces together. So the Russian government has been put in a difficult position where the refining capacity is going to continue to be targeted, and I wouldn't be surprised if the amount of disabled refineries continues to increase. The repairs themselves are costing them quite a lot of money. The military industry is going to be targeted. And as that's getting targeted, sanctions might even continue to intensify after doing the damage that they have done. So they are going to have to find new ways to cut costs and make money. And so they've settled on a tax rise as a possible solution. Mind you, the reason why this is so important is Vladimir Putin explicitly stated that he would not raise taxes. He said that the war would not make you raise taxes. This isn't going to affect how people in Russia live their life. You're going to be able to keep being Russian, and the war shall continue. And in order to keep the political apathy that the war lives and dies on alive, that might have to be the case. So that's why this has not been confirmed by official sources, and we know for sure that they're going to do the VAT increase, but we know that they're talking about it because they're running out of options. Eventually, the war will spill out to those who try to hide from it, either through the drones flying over their homes on their route to oil refineries, or through the way the Russian economy continues to further slide down the sword that it has placed itself upon. The Russian government is considering rising the rate of the value-added tax to keep the budget deficit in check and maintain reserve. For sources told Reuters, despite public assurances from President Vladimir Putin, there will be no tax rise. The draft budget is expected to be submitted to Parliament in September. Well, September 29th, so in 2 days. Its key components are agreed with Putin beforehand and are unlikely to be significantly altered during the formal parliamentary debate. Russia, in the 4th year of its war in Ukraine, has raised personal income and corporate taxes this year, but the government still had to triple its federal budget deficit estimate to 1.7% of gross domestic product in May. It is now set to exceed that target, according to an unnamed official quoted by state media this month. State media, Russian media, says they're going to exceed that target. The 0.9% of GDP deficit for 2026 included in a budget law last year also looks likely to be exceeded. No, it will not be likely to be exceeded. It will be exceeded because there simply is not enough GDP growth to shrink it. The only GDP growth there really is within the war sector. 4 sources close to the government confirmed a report this week by The Bell, a media outlet based outside of Russia, that the government is discussing lifting the value-added tax rate from 22% from 20% to curb the deficit. The report did not specifically specify wait a second. No way. No way. What? No, this can't be real. Okay, Ukraine's value-added tax has 4 rates: 0, 7, 14, and 20. If they do this, the VAT tax in Russia, the country that's invading, the much smaller country, will be higher than the VAT tax in Ukraine. I didn't even think of that. What? It just came to me. Oh my God. Isn't that interesting? How can the deficit be reduced while adhering to the budget rule? Only by raising taxes, because there's hardly anything left to cut, either military spending or social spending. So that comes from the Russian government source. VAT accounted for 37% of budget revenues in 2024, and possible increase could have the projected 2026 budget according to could have the 2026 deficit. Russia's economy has continued to grow despite tightening Western sanctions over the war, but its GDP is expected to slow down, and the growth that's it's concentrated in is largely war economies now. So, if the goal now, look, they haven't made a final decision, and I don't want to say that this is a final decision, but if they have to deal with the problem, they have three options. One, okay, is cut military spending. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, the other two are cut social spending, which is an option. They could choose to go after pensions, which would probably be one of the things to pass the war on to the rest of the people that could get one of the most negative reactions. They could go out and they could cut other social services. They could cut infrastructure rebuilding. They could cut all sorts of stuff. But the more they cut, that will spill over to the public, just like in the same way a tax increase of the VAT tax, which will inevitably be passed down to Russian consumers at the same time that we've seen cost of living increases. So this is going to compound that, and it's not going to make them happy. A majority of the Russian public already wants to see the war end. I have no reason to believe that this can have no other effect besides pointing that in a negative direction for the Kremlin, i.e., having more people want it to end so taxes could be lowered again. This is spilling the war over more and more to the Russian public, who have largely been able, from an apathetic position, able to check out of the war and allow people in their 40s and 50s who are in need of a quick fix to their debt problem, or they need money bad, to go out there and join the Russian armed forces. Of course, with the Russian manpower problem, meaning the fact that they have to redeploy troops from Sumy and Kherson to keep up offensive operations because they don't have enough troops to just sustain them without pulling back in Sumy, without, lessening offensive operations in Kherson, or the offensive operations in Kherson, lessening the grip of power in Kherson. They have multiple problems. And so if they're going to need to keep up this system of recruitment, they're going to need not only to keep the military budget where it's at, but to further increase it. The Russians will have to continue increasing military payouts if they want people, an ever-dwindling supply of debtors, to join the Russian armed forces. Or make the decision, which that's, of course, another strain on the budget that they're going to have to address, or move on to conscription and taking conscripts and private conscriptovich and saying they have to go too. They haven't made that move because the one time they started a new conscription wave was the one time we saw even Russian polling say there was a gigantic drop in support for not only the war, but even the government, Putin's government. So they're in a tough position. Do they keep the status as it is and continue to slowly increase payments, seeing that fund dwindle more and more and more? Do they cut social services, which can come back to bite them at home and increase domestic opposition? Or do they increase taxes, which, of course, can have the exact same effect? The Russian government economically is in a tough position. Now, they still have some reserves, foreign cash reserves they can spend. They still have gold. They still have some reserves. They have some wiggle room, but this is not endless. People talk, like the Russians talk about fighting this war for 21 years. They simply wouldn't have the dough, let alone with at this rate of loss, the people either. And that's saying something, but they certainly would not have the dough to keep it as the war's going now. You're not going to be able to entice that many people. $5,000 to $6,000 to $7,000 a month is not something the Russian government could sustain. For the military payments, that is, for anybody who might have been confused.